Good evening and welcome to WBEZ's event on cannabis equity in Illinois. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's a pleasure to have you along. I'm your host, Mariah Wolfel. I'm the reporter at WBEZ who covered Illinois' cannabis industry when recreational weed first became legal about a year ago. Like many people in 2020, though, shortly after the industry got started, a lot of the focus shifted to COVID-19. But before the pandemic began and swept Illinois, we all had our eyes on the state's new cannabis industry, watching to see whether it was going to live up to some major promises. I want to start by taking a quick look back with a short video of some of those promises reiterated on the day the bill was signed.
Erica, it is being called the most progressive law in the country. There's a real focus on social justice and social equity in this law.
Our state, once again, is a leader, putting forward the most equity-centric cannabis legalization in the nation.
Some 315,000 people in the state will see their arrest records wiped clean. A total of more than 700,000 records and low-level convictions. That's the part of this new marijuana law that was missing in every other state.
Signing this bill into law won't undo the justices of the past or make whole the lives that were interrupted. We can't turn the clock back, but we can turn the page.
After 40 years of treating entire communities like criminals, here comes this multi-billion-dollar industry. And guess what? Black and brown people have been put at the very center of this policy in a way that no other state in the country has ever done this before.
In that video, you see journalists, Governor J.B. Pritzker, lawmaker Jahan Gordon Booth talking a lot about equity, referencing the war on drugs, which had a devastating and disproportionate impact on Black and Latino communities. And you see that this legislation really carried with it hope that those people impacted would be at the center of this new industry, the ones making money off of it, or through the legislation, given the ability to wipe their records clean and move forward with their lives. So tonight, as the industry recently passed its 1-year birthday, we focus in and try to answer the question, has the state fulfilled those promises of equity? Spoiler alert for many, the answer is that we're far from it. But let's talk about why and what work still needs to be done. We'll talk with public officials, a dispensary applicant, an advocate, and attorney working on cannabis equity. And I welcome your questions tonight as well. If you have a question for one of our guests or a story to share about your experience with equity in legal cannabis, drop it in the comments thread. And we'll get to as many of your questions as possible. First up, we're going to bring in Illinois State Representative LaShawn Ford of Chicago. Representative Ford was one of many lawmakers who worked on the initial legislation that made marijuana legal, and he's been taking notes and working with advocates throughout the past year to find out what needs to change about that law to improve equity going forward. Representative Ford, thank you so much for joining us tonight. How are you?
Good. Thank you, Mariah, for having me. And
Yeah,
thanks for all
absolutely.
you've all put into putting this panel together.
Yeah, thanks for being a part of it. I want to first start, if you could just kind of table set this for us and remind people watching what the main tenets of equity were in this bill.
So, Mariah, the intent of the law was to make sure that the social equity program would sort of promote and make sure that minorities had an involvement in this emerging market, this emerging economy. We now see is $1 billion in a year. That's a lot of money. And the intent of the law was to make sure that Black and brown people had access to that business.
And what were the main tenets that kind of were codified in the law to make sure that that was going to happen? Can you talk about some of the mandates?
Well, that's really the problem, because when you talk about mandates and you talk about hopes, it's different. So there was a goal to make sure that Black people and brown people had involvement in the cannabis industry, but there were no real mandates that would require it. And that's where I think the law fall short because there are no guarantees.
Mhm. What were some of the efforts to make sure that dispensaries were opened by Black and Brown communities, and why weren't those mandates?
Yeah, so there were social equity grants that were put out so that social equity applicants would have technical assistance with writing their applications and hopefully getting a score that was enough to win their place in the lottery. The problem is those grants that were given out to assist those applicants, none of the applicants won a place in the lottery. None of them scored well enough to be considered in the lottery as of today. It's our hope that after the second bite at the apple, that when the governor's office sends out the second round, I would say, of deficiency notices, we should see more social equity applicants winning their place in the lottery. Because the truth is, our social equity applicants had the best applications that's been submitted. They were thoughtful, they were thorough, and they did the job and they followed the rules. And we hope that the governor's office does everything that he can to get these applications rescored.
Yeah, I want to take a few steps back for people who might not have been following this lottery process. So, as you know very well, when the state started its legal cannabis industry on January 1st, 2020, only people who were licensed to hold open medical dispensaries were able to open recreational dispensaries. But there was a lot of hope in this second round that was going to award new licenses. And the hope for that was that the licenses awarded in that process would be people from the community, people impacted by the war on drugs. Could you talk a little bit about that process, how that actually played out? There were 75 licenses available. And the hope was that those would go to so-called social equity applicants. Could you talk about what a social equity applicant is and how that lottery process played out?
Yeah, so that's very good. I'm glad you brought up the war on drugs because, Mariah, the point of this legislation was to make sure that we dealt with the tragedy of the war on drugs and to deal with some of the wounds of the war on drugs. But what we've seen in Illinois, unfortunately, are new wounds from the work that we've done to try to bring people into the cannabis emerging economy. And there were the social equity applicants had to submit a plan to be considered in it, such as 51% veteran ownership, 51% ownership by Illinois residents. They would get 20% of the points for 50% for social equity applicants. If you could prove that you are a social equity applicant living in a disadvantaged community and you had someone that had criminal backgrounds based on a cannabis conviction, you could get points so that you can win your place in a social equity application. And so there were parameters to help social equity applicants get in, but there was a problem. The problem came in with the veterans' points. And so even though you had applicants submit a strong application and scored well, they didn't have a qualified veteran, which disqualified their application almost, or I should say, it eliminated their chances of making it to the lottery if they didn't have a qualified veteran. And that was a major problem for applicants because the state never, ever really made it clear that the intent of the law was that in order to win your place in the lottery, you had to have a qualified veteran. So all of the social equity applicants that had assistance with the applications by the state's money that was given out as grants, none of them made it. And that's unfortunate because the law was not clear. And so hopefully we could clean that up, Mariah.
And this was, I think this was a big shock to many people because there were 75 licenses available. And they were awarded to, well, not yet awarded, but the people who were initially chosen to move forward to progress to get those licenses, they were just 21 applicants. Could you talk about the people who were chosen to move forward in that lottery process, and the 937 people who were not?
Yeah, all right. So that's a good question. So there were lots of applications, and we should definitely give all those people that invested so much of their time and money in doing so. What happened? Those people that made the lottery, they had qualified veterans, and they made sure that they had all of the other requirements. Disadvantaged community. They lived in the neighborhood where the area was considered a disadvantaged neighborhood. So they checked all the boxes, and they had the advantage of having a veteran. And so they made it into the lottery.
With a perfect score.
With the perfect score.
On their app. And when we're talking about scoring, there's a point system on applications, correct? And so you have to meet in each category, win a certain number of points based on your application. And it turns out that the 21 people who moved forward had perfect scores. And you're saying because many of them took advantage of the veterans portion.
Right, that's what gave them the advantage. But social equity applicants had preference. Every point, extra points on applications for people hurt by a war on drugs was considered. Residency requirement in the disadvantaged community was considered. Previous arrest records were considered. Had to live in 5 out of 10 years in the distressed areas. These were the qualifiers that helped individuals get into the process called social equity in Illinois. So only 6 out of 21 seem to be minority owned right now. And that's a problem.
Okay. So I want to talk, I first want to ask, when did the veterans qualification come into play, and why did that hit so many people by surprise?
Yeah, so the veterans qualification came into play when we passed the law, and it hit so many people by surprise because no one knew, and the state did not make it clear that in order to get a perfect score, you had to have a qualified veteran. And that's what hurt people. They were not able to get a perfect score simply because they did not have a veteran. So it was added late in the process. So when we went through the bill making process, the Senate added it to the bill. And they added the veterans preference to it. It wasn't something that was discussed. It was a late add-on, and that was unfortunate because it really hurt other people, and that wasn't a part of the main discussion. And so
why did you need a perfect score in order to move forward in the licensing process? Because it seems that hurt a lot of people as well, who might have gotten 1 point dinged off of their application, maybe for not having a veteran as an owner, or maybe, for some other reason. Why did you have to have a perfect score in order to move forward?
And Mariah, that's what we've learned, that was a bad add to the bill. We learned that having a perfect score was bad, and now we're looking at fixing the law. Why did you have to have a perfect score? Because that's the way the bill was drafted, unfortunately, and it was a mistake because we've learned that really hurt the process, and we want to change that. And I think that we're moving forward to do that, to make sure that we have what you call a cut score, so that we don't have to deal with this perfect score scenario anymore.
Okay. Well, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the fixes that you're working on, but first, I want to first remind everyone that we're taking your questions. So if you have questions for Representative Ford, please drop them in the comments field. I want to also bring in someone to the conversation who's had firsthand experience with the lottery and application process. Michael Malcolm is from Morgan Park on Chicago's Southwest side. Michael was one of the nearly 1,000 applicants who initially got denied. Of course, the state is reconsidering those applications now, but he's also a cannabis consultant. Hi, Michael, who's helping dispensaries open across the country. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mariah, for having me, and thank you, State Rep, for sharing the space.
So, Michael, I want to first ask you if you could share a little bit about what you envision for your dispensary. What's it going to look like? Who's it going to serve?
Yeah, for sure. So I am from the south side of Chicago. I'm from the Morgan Park neighborhood. So when I envision my dispensary, everything that I do with my brand right now, I'm very much about community. I'm a real estate agent here in Chicago. I've been selling real estate for over 10 years. I've been working in real estate since I've almost 20, since I've been out of high school. It's been about community, building up the community. So, and my brand is a lot about being involved and education about the plant. There's so much that we don't know about the plant, and I'm really looking forward to being able to share that knowledge with people in our community. I think in the Midwest, we are kind of behind on a lot of things in the cannabis industry, just educationally, as well as products and operations. Obviously, the West Coast has that advantage on us because they started first. So I look forward to bringing some of the knowledge and some of the things that I've learned outside of the state of Illinois here.
Michael, your audio sounded very clear at first, but it sounds a little. Representative Ford, can I ask? Is this something similar that you've heard from other applicants who you've been working with, wanting to serve their community? What have you heard from applicants who you worked with who were initially denied?
Oh, I hear applicants investing many people investing their life savings, borrowing money to get in this emerging market because they believe that it's an opportunity to redevelop their communities, provide jobs to the communities. People with backgrounds would be able to work in this profession. And that's what I hear from applicants like Michael Malcolm, that they wanted to get in this business to do good. They wanted to turn the war on drugs into something positive that hurt so many Black and brown people in this nation. And Illinois was supposed to be a leader in that. But of course, we know that we have gotten off to a poor start at making sure that we saw social equity in this cannabis law.
Michael, could you tell me your thoughts on that? I mean, how did you feel when you got rejected initially from the state? How were you notified, and how has that kind of changed your trajectory in life going forward? Are you working on equity as well? And we can come back to you. Oh, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, can you hear? I hope you can hear me better now. So the way I found out, unfortunately, the way that I found out was through the Chicago Sun-Times calling me on my phone, asking me what I thought about it. My phone was blowing up at the time, but I had already been doing I've been talking to the Sun-Times a lot. And so I was on they were familiar with me enough so that when the announcement came out, that was the first phone call that I actually got. Just to answer as far as my trajectory, I haven't changed at all. I'm still working in the industry right now. I have things going on outside the state, but honestly, I was just telling someone earlier today that I really look forward to bringing some of the knowledge that I've gained throughout the years here to Illinois. So I really wanted to be a part of this new market. Every state is its own market because the laws are different in each state. And so I've learned so much over the last few years. I really wanted to make sure that I'm a part of this market. I've had opportunities in California as well as Michigan, but I told both people I really want to stay here to see what I could bring here.
Yeah. Mariah, you're muted.
Representative Ford, could you talk a little bit about what the state is doing now for applicants like Malcolm or like Michael, who initially got denied?
Yes, Mariah, I think that we're hopefully on the right track, because applicants that have invested their life savings and borrowed money to get into this emerging economy should be respected. And now we're lucky to have a governor that's not a venture capitalist like our last governor that we had with Rauner. We have a business owner, and he understands that every day that a person that's investing in a business is not able to open those doors hurts that business owner. And so I'm hopeful now that the governor is going to do everything that he can to work with the legislature to pass a trailer bill to fix the problems that we caused with the first bill. So therefore, there should be an A and a B. We need to make sure that those people that made it in the first round get their licenses and get moving so that they can start opening their doors, creating jobs, and rebuilding the community. And then immediately the state wants to do what you call a round B, so that people that may have been impacted by maybe the requirement to have a veteran, they can now get in the lottery without paying a new application fee, or I should say they can now reapply for the lottery without an application fee and have a chance at a new 75 lottery, so that we can hurry up and get the small startup businesses in this industry. Because right now, the mainstream industry, they're dominating, and every day that we delay Michael Malcolm from getting in, his license value goes down and his customers will leave because they're going to find new places to do business. And so we have to hurry with the governor. He has to have what you call urgency to support the small businesses like Michael Malcolm.
On the same track, I want to take this question from Facebook. Laura asks, Representative Ford, in addition to the veteran status issue, some applicants did not receive notifications for deficiencies. As Michael said, he found out in the Sun-Times. Will they have a chance to resubmit in the current round, or will they have to wait until the next round after the law is revised?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So there will be a new round of deficiency notices, because there were people, like it sounded like Michael never got his deficiency notices. We have been working with the governor's office, so there will soon be deficiency notices sent out to all the people that did not get in the lottery, so that they have 10 days to cure any deficiency and try to score a perfect score in order to get into that lottery. So yes, there's still an opportunity for people that did not in the first notice round get their notice. There will be more time for people to cure their deficiencies and get in this first round of lottery so that they can be a social equity business.
And Michael, on that, you said you had found out in the Sun-Times, but did you end up getting a so-called deficiency notice from the state saying what was wrong with your application, why you were denied, and could you talk about what you're doing now to fix any issues?
Yeah, sure. So just to clarify, I found out from the Chicago Sun-Times that I didn't make it to the next round. That's when I found out about the final scores. We did receive one deficiency, and it was something very minor. It was something I didn't have 1 year of my tax returns. It was something like that. And so that's what they asked me about. But it wasn't for some of the things that they dinged me for. I still didn't have a perfect score, but it was some very minor things. And those things that they did ding me for, we didn't receive any deficiency notices for. So I just want to clarify that point. And the second part of your question, as far as moving forward with the next round, I'm thinking about that. If I have to be honest with you, though, I really think that the state did a lot of things from the very beginning that I honestly never really thought it was very equitable, the way that the state set up the entire social equity program from the very beginning. I didn't really think there was much chance of equity. For one, there's a limited amount of licenses. It's so limited that it creates a demand. I think the state had an opportunity to create an industry of abundance, right? Because it's a brand new licenses. So they could have done like some other states model where they make the license cheaper for everyone and do it. And maybe they don't call it social equity, but they just give everyone a fair shot and let the free market do what they do. By limiting the number of licenses that they're going to give out, it creates a situation where the demand is extremely high, and there's a scarcity in the market. And with a market that you create with scarcity, there can be no equity, right, in a scarce market. So I think that's the first thing. The other thing that the state did that I think for myself, made me think about how I applied to your question is that the state put out the dispensary licenses before they did craft grow and cultivation. So what I know from my experience in working in different markets is that's how many of the social equity license holders in other markets fail, because they give these people dispensaries, but they have no access to supply. So that is why, and then they get starved out the market. They end up selling their license. Maybe they make $500,000 to $1 million, but maybe that business is worth $10 million. Maybe it's worth $20 million. But these people, some people, that's the most money that they've ever seen at one time. So they take the deal, right? That's how the social equity programs fail in other states, right? And then the other part of that is that the social equity, I think the other part of that is and I'll just be transparent here. I really felt like I partnered with an in-state operator here in Illinois. And the reason that I did that was exactly because I didn't want to be squeezed out the market. I knew if I got a dispensary that all these in-state operators already have their own retail. So why would they give me their best product? Why would they give me the same product at the same price that they're giving to their retails, right? They're always going to charge me more. They can do that because they're the source, right? So I made my deal up front and I partnered with the in-state operator. And I honestly feel like the state put me in that position because I saw that they were putting the licenses out first. And then the big part is the loophole that I think gets overlooked a lot when we talk about how people can even qualify for social equity. Because yes, you have to have a cannabis conviction on your record like I do, or you had to live in one of those so-called disadvantaged neighborhoods. I didn't qualify in that way because I haven't lived in that area in the last 5 years or whatever, but I'm from those areas. But there was another loophole in there. And the loophole was that you could also have a company and your employees, 51% of the employees at your company live in that area. So what that means is you could be a rich person from anywhere inside of Chicago. And as long as your company has 51% of their employees that live in those areas, then you qualify for social equity. So that really means that anybody could qualify for social equity. And then I think the last point was the veteran issue, which I think State Rep Ford has spoken on eloquently. And that was another thing that, again, from the very beginning, me and my partners, we acknowledged that. And I always said that there was no way that there could ever be any equity in this market if they mandate that the veterans have to own 51% and have 51% ownership and control of the company. I always have to say this, I have nothing against vets. My father is a Marine. I have several active duty service members in my family, some that are overseas right now, right? I have nothing against the veterans, but 1% of our general population are vets, 12% of the Black community. That, just like State Rep Ford said, there was no mention of that being the intent of the bill or the legislation when it passed. So I think that if there's ever going to be anything, when I think about going through for the next round, I almost feel the same way. Unless some of these major things change, I honestly feel for me, like, what's the point? I might work in the industry as a consultant, but going after licenses, I honestly don't know if it's worth it.
Yeah.
Well, on that, I mean, Representative Ford, Michael just laid out a lot of issues. I mean, how tenable is it that these get fixed so that applicants who, may be discouraged, like Malcolm, aren't turning away from the market in Illinois?
I think we're in a better position now because we have people like Michael, Malcolm, and then you're going to have Attorney Purnell on. We're working with them. We're going to fix this law. I'm so grateful for the applicants that have dedicated their time and their efforts to get this right. They've come out, they've been upset because there were no opportunities to appeal the process. They spoke up, and that's going to happen. We're going to fix that. You know, they were just blindsided. The applicants were blindsided in this whole process, and that has to change. And we're going to work together to get it right. The governor is committed. The governor has admitted that this has been a failure, and the people that have invested their hard-earned money will not stand for anything but a fix to this legislation. Make no mistake about it, people have been left out of this $1 billion that have been made in Illinois, and it's totally unfair, and I don't appreciate it myself. So clearly the legislators have to step up and get this done, and we need the governor to support us. And just finally, I'll tell you, Mariah, we have to make sure that these cannabis industries cannot be successful if we don't also do work on craft grow. So we're going to be working and thinking about legislation to help craft grow compete with these big companies, because that's a problem as well.
Quickly before we let you both go, Representative Ford, can you go over the timeline for people? We also have a question, are new applicants being considered? But can you go over the timeline for what's next?
Yeah, what's next is we need to pass legislation in Springfield. That's the job of the members in the House and the Senate, to clean up the mess that was made with the cannabis law. And with that, that will help set up a round B lottery so that we can have in position a new 75 of social equity applicants to get a chance. Before we, and while we're fixing the law, we also have to make sure that the applicants that never received their deficiency notices, they must get those deficiency notices. They must get 10 days to cure those deficiencies, and they must be rescored. That has to happen so that they can have a chance at the lottery. Also, there were applicants that put their application in and they were not scored properly. They must be scored properly. So we have applicants that had everything right, and they were not scored properly. We have to take a look at all those applications and make sure that they got the points that they deserve. And when we do that, we'll move forward with the lottery for round A. And immediately after, there should be a round B of 75 new applicants.
Okay, and is the state accepting new applications, or is it only those who in this first 75 license round, or is it only those who initially applied?
That's right, Mariah. It's only those that initially applied that will be allowed in around A and B.
Got it. Michael, is there anything else you want to wrap up with? What are you going to be watching for in the coming months? Anything that could happen to make you want to stay or, operate a dispensary in Illinois?
Yeah, so I mean, I want to stay. Not much needs to change, but I want to be here. But really, I just want to see, like exactly what we're talking about, real equity. I have some ideas just from working in different markets and seeing what works and what doesn't work. So I think, again, just because it's a new industry here, we have opportunity to shape it like we want to. And I appreciate State Rep Ford again for him coming out and saying exactly that. I think one of my biggest sticking points was the veteran issue. Again, like I said, I had the discussion with my in-state operating MSO. These people have large organizations, right? We had this discussion. What do you think about this veteran point issue? Again, I am the majority owner and controller of that company. And I'm not a veteran, right? But they still bet on me. We still put in those 10 dispensary license applications, right? So they believed and that the state would come around. And so I'm going to hope on a dream that the state will recognize the same thing that me and my partners did, and that they need to open it up to everyone.
Thank you, Representative Ford and Michael, so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Now we're going to turn to another major piece of this legislation in terms of equity, the expungement portion of the legislation. The law allowed for low-level cannabis arrests and convictions to be expunged from people's records to try to combat the impacts of the war on drugs. The person in charge of making that happen in our area is Cook County State's Attorney Kim Fox. Cook County, as you can imagine, was hit hardest by the war on drugs in terms of regions in Illinois, and State's Attorney Fox has been at work over the past year to get thousands of records expunged. State's Attorney Fox, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me, Mariah.
Absolutely. So I want to start out very basic. Can you tell us why expungements are important? Just go through what a small cannabis arrest or conviction can spiral into for people.
We often think about people being convicted of heinous crimes and their lives being turned upside down, but really it is the small convictions that really turn people's lives upside down every single day, what we call collateral consequences. When someone has a conviction, when they apply for a loan, there's a question on an application. When they apply for housing, if they want to rent an apartment, there's a question. You apply for a job, if you wanted to get licensing, all of these things tied to a conviction will prevent you or lock you out of legitimate economies, affordable housing, the opportunity to get an education, the opportunity to provide for yourself. And so it is one of these things that when we talk about violence prevention, crime prevention, that we often overlook, that people who come out of the justice system are more likely to find themselves going back because of the collateral consequences of the initial conviction. And again, we're not just talking about violent crime. We're talking about these convictions, these small, low-level offenses, or not even just low-level offenses, but convictions related to marijuana, in an environment where we're talking about the state having seen $1 billion just in its first year and people making money hand over fist in a new economy that has precluded people from getting even the most basic jobs at McDonald's for having a previous conviction.
Okay. Tell us who is eligible to get their records expunged through the law.
So through the law, we looked at the amounts that are now going to be, or that are now legal. It's been a year. It's been a long year. And it is the 30 grams or less. And so if you have a previous conviction for 30 grams or less, those convictions are automatically available, not just for expungement, but for it to be vacated. So the law in Illinois is unique in that it is not just expunging the records, which means ridding yourselves of the records from public view. It is reopening the case and having that initial, whether it's a plea of guilty or a finding of guilty, vacated. That is taken away as though it had never happened. And then those records are no longer available. And so that is automatic. You don't have to pay a fee. You don't have to petition a court. We here in Cook County, our office does the legwork, the paperwork to go into court to reopen the case, vacate the conviction, and then have the record expunged.
Okay. And I know there's another category of non-automatic expungements that you've also been working to get through the courts. Can you talk about who's eligible for those and how those have been going?
So for non-automatic, that's for things that are over the 300 or 30 gram threshold up to 500. And people can petition to be able to have those records expunged. So it's not done just by our office generating a list. Someone would actually have to petition the court or petition our office. We would do a review based on the totality of the circumstances, and then make a recommendation as to whether or not that should happen. We in Cook County have taken a more expansive view on this because we recognize that while the 30 gram threshold that has now been made legal is where we are in Illinois, there is also still that recognition that this $1 billion industry, the arbitrariness of 30 versus 31 or 100 still locks out people. And so we want to make sure that even though it is not automatic, that we are taking a look and taking an expansive approach of basically a default of we will vacate those convictions as well if you petition us.
Got it. And yeah, you kind of alluded to it, but can you talk about why 30 grams is the threshold?
30 grams is a threshold that was negotiated by the legislative body in consultation with law enforcement groups and advocacy groups, and it encompasses, most of what we saw for people who were getting arrested. But again, it is not. It makes sense, but it is rather arbitrary when you think of that cutoff allowing someone to be able to have those collateral consequences dismissed versus someone who has slightly more. And it is, again, something that was negotiated. It is the amount that is now legal. And so it makes sense that that's where we are. But I don't believe that it is expansive enough. If we really are talking about equity and about the harm of the war on drugs, this is just the first step. That amount is kind of the entry step, but I think we need to go for so much further.
And I want to talk about that more, but first, can you give us an update? How has the past year gone? Out of the eligible records in Cook County, how many have been automatically expunged? How many has your office worked to get non-automatically expunged? Give us the numbers.
So the good news was that we had been partnering with an organization called Code for America out of California, who brought the technology to bear that allowed for us to work with the Illinois State Police to get the list of folks who are eligible to have their records automatically expunged. And then they created software that would pre-populate the document. So it wasn't that we had to go and type in people and look it up. They could get these documents together by the hundreds in a matter of minutes. And so back in December of 2019, 2019, we were able to do the first 1,000 fairly quickly in an afternoon. And the plan was to work with the stakeholders to have a call in the courthouse to be able to do this on a regular cadence. And then COVID-19 hit. And the challenges that have faced our criminal justice system over the course of the last 10 months weighed down the system. The backlog continued. And so we were, between March and October, were unable to do any of the expungements because of the slowdown. Back in October, we started up again. I believe we got an additional 1,200 of those cases done. And now we have a new clerk of the court in Iris Martinez, which again, we're now working with to get a regular cadence. So of the automatic expungements, we're somewhere around 2,200 of those that have been done out of a population that I think that's about just 10% of what we could do. And so much more to go. And of those who have petitioned, those numbers have been fairly small, again, because of the slowdown with the courts as it relates to this law. Now, there are organizations like Cabrini Green Legal Aid who've been doing this work for a number of years, who are working through some of those petitions even before the law was enacted that we're continuing to work on. And I can give you a more solid number, but it's small, largely because of the inaccess to the courts.
Got it. So you're back at it on a regular basis, expunging records starting from October.
Yes.
Okay, got it. I want to talk a little bit about how your relationship with Chicago Police has been over the past year. I know that before recreational cannabis was even legal, your stance was that your office was not going to prosecute low offense cannabis offenses. Have you still been getting low cannabis offenses to prosecute from Chicago Police, and how have you been operating?
The numbers were not significant even before the law came into bear. And I will say that my predecessor, for whatever her faults may have been, even she had recognized that there was no real utility in prosecuting these low-level cannabis offenses. And so the numbers weren't what we were seeing even 5 years ago. They were going down. I think part of the issue that we've seen related to cannabis cases that have come to us is they're not necessarily standalone cannabis cases. What we find oftentimes is that it's a pretext, right? That people would be arrested because of the smell of cannabis coming from their car, and then they wanted to search the car. And if you didn't find anything, then because you've searched the car, then you might try to charge somebody with the cannabis offense. We very strongly believe, and even as we were pushing for legalization, that these pretextual stops based on cannabis should also stop. recognizing again that this is now going to be legal. We are not advocating for people being able to drive. They should not drive while under the influence, but not using cannabis as a vehicle by which to basically move, stop, and frisk to stop and drive. And so there's some tension there, but we weren't seeing numbers where people were, stand alone being arrested for cannabis cases like we were before. It usually was in conjunction to something else. And those numbers are small.
Okay. Finally, you had mentioned a little bit about wanting to expand on this law to, broaden the scope of who's eligible for expungement. Can you talk about any work going on in that realm and what you'd like to see moving forward, just as a wrap up?
Yeah, so we've been talking to legislators, and would be remiss if I didn't talk about the tremendous work that Representative Ford has been doing down in Springfield. Right now, when we talk about the 30 grams, it's also just for possession. And what we're talking about is that we need to expand this for sellers. The people who were engaged in this economy, for all of the conversations around equity, we have to remind ourselves that for a number of these folks living in these neighborhoods, this is the economy. The disinvestment that we have seen in so many of our neighborhoods where businesses have left, there no one has come in, and unemployment rates are through the roof, disproportionately when we look at unemployment, Black male unemployment between the ages of 18 and 35 almost doubles what we see in the general population. So selling marijuana was part of the economy. It just is a fact. And now that economy has shifted and is a legal economy, to lock out people who were engaged in marijuana sales makes absolutely no sense. That when we're having a debate about licensing and making sure that people get in and people who have been impacted are able to get licensing, how do we justify in the expungement piece, in the vacating piece, that same population because they were engaged in sales and not simply possession? And so that's something, as conversations are happening, as Representative Ford said, around trailer bills are looking to expand, that we are going to be pushing for. In the meantime, using our discretion, again, to evaluate these cases as they come and moving to have those cases vacated. But I think it is disingenuous for us to really talk about an equity piece, even on the expungement side, when we're only talking about possessors and not people who are engaged in sales. And, I will say one of the arguments that I've heard from law enforcement was, well, it was illegal at the time that they did it, right? This somehow seems unfair to now vacate these records and give this advantage because they knew that it was illegal. And again, I think that's the rhetoric of a war on drugs that was failed, that was never about health and safety, but really rooted in systemic racism and control, particularly in these neighborhoods, that you use that rhetoric. And now we're talking about the fact that Black and Brown communities can't get licenses. It is this double speak that tears at my soul. It was illegal when Black people were doing it. It's now legal and Black people can't get into business, and we're not going to make pathways for them based on their records in the background. And so I'm wholly committed to this. However, we have to get it done. I want a legislative fix, but in the meantime, we're looking in ways of using our prosecutorial discretion to do it.
Okay, well, those are some actions we'll look out for, including a trailer bill in the future. I really appreciate you joining us tonight. Thanks so much, Stacey.
Thank you.
Before we wrap up, I want to bring in just one more voice into the conversation. Akili Parnell is an attorney and program counsel at Chicago's Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. He's worked with lawmakers directly on the original legislation and amendments to it with the goal of ensuring Illinois lives up to the equity provisions in this law. Hi, Akili.
Hi, Mariah. How are you?
Good. Akili, you also have represented dispensary applicants seeking licenses from the state, like Michael himself, who we heard from earlier. You've worked with the Cannabis Equity Illinois Coalition to push current dispensaries to sign community benefits agreements. So you're really involved in this industry from multiple perspectives. Just thank you so much for joining us. I want you to help us wrap up here. You've been listening to the program. While we're still on expungement, can you first give us your take on the expungement process so far. I know State's Attorney Fox covered a lot of ground. And also, where can you direct people who might be watching who need help with record expungements?
Yeah, absolutely. To start, I'm really grateful for the work that State's Attorney Kim Fox and her office has done. They've really been leaders and been really progressive on this issue, as well as legalization in general. And so we appreciate that. There's still a lot of work to be done there. There's still a significant backlog of expungements that have been filed, petitions that have been filed that need to be processed, both in Cook County and statewide. And so we'd like to see some improvements there, in addition to some technical fixes that can make the process of getting your record expunged or sealed easier. And so I know that Illinois Clerk Counties Association or Clerks Association has introduced a bill in last session that would help fix some of those technical glitches and broaden access to expungements. And then another really important point that she made before is that we need to expand eligibility for expungement to people that have been involved in the unregulated market and that were making maybe a living selling cannabis. Some of those experts that are disproportionately, or at least those that got convicted, who were disproportionately Black or Latinx. We're going to talk about equity. Expungements and broadening access to expungements has to be a focus of that effort. And so that's something that needs to be taken up in Springfield. And so we encourage our lawmakers to begin to do that. Again, we've had great leadership from representatives like Representative Ford, who we've worked with closely over the past several months to improve our social equity program, and expungement needs to be front and center along with that.
Okay. And do you have resources for people where they can go to get help with expungement?
Yeah, absolutely. So we recommend that folks reach out to the Cannabis Equity Illinois Coalition, who has been a leader in that space, both in terms of advocacy and then connecting folks with resources to get their records expunged. In addition, on the legal side, Cabrini Green Legal Aid, as well as Legal Aid Chicago.
Thank you. So what has stuck out to you, either from the license, I guess mainly from the licensing section, since we did talk about expungement, in terms of what Illinois' cannabis industry, where it's headed and what we need to do in order to make sure it's as equitable as possible? Just if you could just run through what your takeaway is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first I would say, we need to be more aggressive on this. I don't think that anyone is particularly surprised that we're still working to make the industry more equitable. We knew that we're starting out with zero equity. And so we were trying to sort of reverse engineer or create equity as the industry expands, which is really difficult to do. And I understand there are a lot of reasons that go into that. That's sort of the cards that we've been dealt. And so we have to improve the licensing framework, which Representative Ford talked about, and we'll get into in a minute. But we have to tighten that and improve that if we're going to end up creating the equity that we want. But really, this is an urgent issue. I mean, time is of the essence. We just saw that the current operators made over $1 billion last year in sales. And so that first mover advantage, in addition to the money that they made, is going to help them increase their stranglehold on the market. And it's a significant injustice. And so we really do need the legislature to act as soon as possible to help fix this situation.
Could you talk a little bit about what you're working on urgently in terms of making the licensing process more equitable?
Absolutely. So I've been working with sort of leading cannabis equity organizations in the state, the Cannabis Equity Illinois Coalition, Chicago Normal Scene, EAT, which stands for Equity and Transformation. And we've come up with a legislative agenda that we've shared with, I feel like at this point, most state legislators in the state. And so that agenda includes fixing the scoring process. We talked before about setting a threshold. You shouldn't have to have a perfect score in order to run a retail store, which is essentially what a dispensary is. We understand it's highly regulated. This is a retail store. You shouldn't have to be perfect and compete with, multi-state billion-dollar companies just in order to get into the business, especially from an equity lens. So fixing the scoring process, that threshold score, in addition to the deficiency process, making sure that there's clarity on what to expect in that process and that it's implemented consistently across the board. Second, we'd like to see another lottery. That's a sort of a fix to how we sort of bungled the first process, and then also ensuring that there's a broad opportunity for folks to come in these early days. And then we also talked about closing those loopholes, something that's sort of been deemed the slave master clause, which Rep. 4 talked about before. There's this clause where, even although you're not building ownership through this qualification, that you can become a social equity applicant just by committing to hire folks from disproportionately impacted areas. But the problem is you don't even have to continue to hire those folks. You can hire them for the application phase. Theoretically, you could immediately fire them. And so that's not building equity. And so we know that, maybe that hasn't been broadly used, but that's certainly a loophole that needs to be closed. There's some other areas in the application process that, are vulnerable to exploitation. In addition, we'd like to see caps on the number of licenses that can be won and the number of applications you could submit, because we know that, sort of better capitalized firms, which tended to be, majority white owned or white backed, had more money to sort of game the system and submit as many applications as they could, which sort of swayed the odds in their favor. That's not unlawful, but certainly not fair, and certainly not consistent with the spirit of equity that the bill intends. And then also, we talked about craft grow before. We don't want to see social equity applicants in stores fail. And so they need adequate access to supply. And we also need the opportunity to be on the production and manufacturing. Huge opportunity there. So much of the conversation ends up being about the retail dispensaries, because those are consumer facing. But cultivation is also a huge opportunity. And so in order for this to work, we need more access to product, and we need social equity applicants to be involved in the production of products.
There's just so much to be done on all realms, on all fronts of this legislation. Meanwhile, the recreational cannabis industry is continuing. There are dispensaries in Chicago and throughout Illinois that are majority white owned. For people who want to participate in this new industry, but still do their part to make sure that it's equitable, what would you say to the everyday Illinoisan who's listening, who wants to take part?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is, vote with your dollar. You don't necessarily have to go join an advocacy organization, although I encourage you to do that. You don't necessarily have to go start a business, but if you care about equity and you want to make an impact, and one that can easily be felt by the existing operators, go and shop with those operators who have made strong commitments to equity, like signing a community benefits agreement. The Nature's Care dispensary in West Loop is a great example of that signed a community benefits agreement with the Cannabis Equity Illinois Coalition to hire and reinvest in communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. They also have a minority social equity operator right now. And so while this dispensary may not be owned, it is Black operated. So examples like that. There's a few other Mission dispensaries on the south side. And so go and support those dispensaries and those cannabis companies that display a concrete commitment to social equity. Another opportunity is to join Chicago NORML, join the Cannabis Equity Illinois Coalition, join SEEing, come work with us, come do the advocacy work, come do the community education work, and learn about the industry. And then lastly, there's opportunities outside of just owning a dispensary or owning a cultivation facility. As Mike and Malcolm talked about before, there's a whole swath of ancillary businesses that you can be a part of. And that's everything from marketing to creating eco-friendly packaging, which is another huge issue in cannabis, is the sort of environmental impacts that this industry may have. There's opportunities there by creating solutions to that. There's banking solutions, compliance solutions, almost anything imaginable that you would think of in a consumer packaged goods industry or retail industry. So those are some pretty concrete ways that folks can get involved.
Thank you so much, Akili. Thanks for swooping in here last minute and sharing all your thoughts with us. Thanks for joining. Have such a good night.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. And thanks to all of our guests tonight. You can find links to everyone you heard from on the comment thread. You'll also find a link to a survey where you can offer feedback on tonight's conversation and offer suggestions on what you'd like to see next. We'd really appreciate your thoughts. We have more virtual events coming up. You can join reporter Shannon Heffernan on Monday for Minding Your Mental, a conversation about stress, grief, and mental health during COVID. Find more information at wbez.org/events. Thank you so much for joining me. Good night.